The Pur Sang Bugatti Type 35, if this were a real Bugatti Type 35, one that went for $42 bazillion at L'Auction de Snoot in Monaco or someplace, maybe we would have been a little more careful with it. But it wasn't a real Bugatti, built in Molsheim in the 1920s. It was built last year by the Argentine carmaker Pur Sang to the precise specifications that Ettore Bugatti himself detailed 90 years ago in France. Like Ettore's original, it still had a handmade single overhead cam, 2.3-liter, supercharged straight-8 with an updraft carburetor feeding a bi-block engine configuration with the head cast into the block. It had alloy wheels that included the brake drums as part of the wheel, a hollow front axle to reduce unsprung weight, and the lower part of the engine was a stress member of the chassis. And, just like the original, all the body panels were hand-rolled on an English wheel, and every square-headed bolt was made by hand just as they were in the 1920s. But it wasn't real. Which was great. So we could be a little less gentle with it. We could drive it more like the race car it is, more like a 32 Ford with Brookville body panels and a SoCal Speed Shop frame. In fact, when Pur Sang's commercial director of North America John Bothwell was warming it up for our drive and needed to hold it in place with the engine running, he just backed it up against his own little 1965 Fiat and let the Fiat rear bumper act as a wheel choke for the Type 35's perfectly pointed rear body cone. A voice inside our head screamed at this, but it didn't scream loud enough for Bothwell to hear, and it wouldn't have mattered to Bothwell anyway. So when we got into the driver's seat and took off, rather than treating it with kid gloves, white kid gloves that would not mar the finish or transfer fingerprint skin oil onto some forbidden surface, we simply put it in gear and floored the sucker. We might have even squealed the tires a bit. Or maybe that was us squealing with delight. In any case, the Bugatti launched. This was no delicate museum piece kept in a helium-filled glass case like the Declaration of Independence. This was a freaking hot rod. We drove it through the semi-busy streets of Tony Newport Beach, California, like some kind of high school kid who has talked his daddy into buying him a muscle car. There was no reason to hold back, so we didn't. And the Bugatti responded. The clutch was a little goofy. After trying to smoothly modulate it, we just lifted our foot off and it seemed to sort things out on its own. There was an amount of torque available that wasn't called gobs back in the 20s but which would be called that maybe 50 years later in car magazines. And the brakes, while pulling the car in various directions seemingly as they felt like pulling it, really stopped the car. It was easy to drive, easy to brake, easy to steer. There was nothing overly weird about it, either. The pedals were in the same order as a modern car: dash, clutch, brake and gas, left to right dash, and the shifter, though it was outside the car body, was of a recognizable pattern, albeit with first gear left and back in a dog leg. The details of an original Type 35 are present on this one, right down to the square bolts and the leather pads bushing various shafts throughout the engine bay. We've got all the weird little quirky things in it, like all the leather couplings and all that, Bothwell said, pointing at things in the engine bay. You've got your leather camshaft coupling and supercharger coupling. While there are all those wonderfully accurate details like the square bolt heads, machined surfaces, wire fasteners and cable pulleys, there are a few differences from the original. There is a plain bearing crank instead of Ettore's roller bearing crank, a dry clutch instead of a wet clutch, the firing order of the straight-8 is more efficient, one of the belt drives under the hood is not the original leather, and there are CNC machined, instead of hand machined, wheels.